Hello again, everyone. Welcome back to Free Philosophy, the video series we're putting on here at Liberty for the People. I am the deeply mysterious and anonymous blogger behind that fine site, and I'm here to continue with what we talked about in the first installment of this series of videos, which is sort of covering some of the basic issues and questions that you encounter when you are having discussions with people about political philosophy as a libertarian and as an anarchist and so forth. So if we assume that, I did my job last time, and I've more or less convinced you now that we anarchists are not crazy, and we're not, just naively utopian, then the next question is going to be, to build some sort of basic case for why we do object to the state in the first place. So, even if we're not crazy, you can still legitimately ask, well, okay, but, what is so wrong with the state, Mr. Anarchist, Mr. Libertarian? So I'll tell you, there's two basic problems with with any society that is ruled by a state, and there's one of those, and there are two different kinds of problems. One of them is moral, one of those is economic. The moral problem, in short, is that the state engages in violence. It initiates, to be clear, it initiates violence against people who were not already engaging in violence before the state showed up. So it's not just defending people against the violence of others or something like that. The state itself initiates a new cycle of violence, if you will, against people who had been living peacefully before then. So that's the first major moral problem with the state. And the second major problem with the state is economic, which is that the state, by its very nature, is incapable of managing scarce resources in an calculating and efficient way. And of course, that has moral implications, because when you hurt an economy, you are causing people to suffer. But it's an economic problem, in the proper sense of the term. So we've got our moral problem of violence, and we have an economic problem of badly allocating resources. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about each of those in turn. So when the state engages in violence, what we mean by that is two things, really. Number one, the state gets its income from taxation. And it might not get all of its income from taxation, depending on exactly how we want to define. It might not get all of its income through violence, but that depends on how we define violence. But it most definitely does get the vast majority of its income through violence, particularly through taxation. And literally, if you think about it, taxation is a very unique way of gathering wealth. If any private citizen were to run around saying, "I need $50, so you need to give it to me," and if you don't want to give it to them of your own free will, they take it one way or another. We don't think that society is improved by gaining wealth in that way. And the only time that we allow this sort of behavior is when the state does it, and it is odd, is it not, to get wealth that way? It's clearly, at the very least, a different way of going about your business and getting wealth for yourself. So, and the fact that society thinks it's legitimate, and whereas if an individual person did it, we would call them a thief or a mugger, is curious. The second way in which the state engages in violence is that it quite literally, as we said a moment ago, provides services to the society by going out and initiating violence against people who don't want to follow its rules. So the state essentially makes rules for how society should run, and that by itself is not a problem. Any just society, any well-functioning society will have rules, and will have regulations of various kinds, and we'll talk in future videos perhaps about exactly what we mean by that. But the problem with the state is not that it makes rules. It's that it initiates violence against otherwise peaceful people who aren't following the rules. And that is indeed something that we as anarchists think is avoidable. You do not have to have a society that does that kind of thing. So imposing violence, initiating violence against peaceful people is morally problematic, to say the least. Now, there may be a comeback response to this. The defenders of the state have spent centuries arguing these very points, and indeed we'll talk about some of that in future installments, the ways that they try to respond. But what I just want to make sure we understand right now is that this is a legitimate moral concern. Okay, you might have an answer. You might be able to say, for instance, that, well, yes, you're right, it's unfortunate the state has to behave that way, but the state is still a necessary evil, because if the state didn't engage in this sort of violence, well, then we would have even worse consequences to society, or something like that. Well, you can try to make that kind of an argument, as a reasonable launching off point for discussion. That's fine. But when you make that argument, you are conceding the basic anarchist point, at least as I've made it so far, which is that there is something on the surface morally problematic, morally troublesome, that makes us scratch our moral heads about the way the state operates. Okay? So that's the basic moral objection to the state. It is a violent institution. There's a side note here about this, which deals with natural rights. Libertarians don't all agree with the idea of natural rights, but if you do hold to a notion of natural rights, then you can also express the immorality of the state at kind of a, for lack of a better word, kind of a deeper level, by showing that every individual person literally has a right to say his body and his property and to use those things as he sees fit. And so when the state comes in and uses violence against someone, it's literally preventing them from exercising their own right to their own body and to their own property, which includes their body. But whether or not people want to, some libertarians don't make as big of a deal out of property rights per se or out of natural rights per se, and that's a sort of yet another philosophical question that can be discussed. But as a property rights absolutist myself, I thought I would bring it up. All right, so now we go to the economic issue, the economic problem, which can often be misunderstood by folks who want to make it. But libertarians are not exactly the same as typical conservatives, the Rush Limbaugh talking head types who talk about the free market. Libertarian advocacy of the free market is a bit more, hopefully, goes a bit more to the root of what makes a society just. And it does something a little more complicated, I would hope, than simply what Rush Limbaugh usually does, which is imply that successful business owners are good, period, or people who have wealth in the society must have done something good to get that wealth, period. That's clearly not the case. This is not about supporting the wealthy per se. It's not about supporting business per se. What it's about is supporting the basic idea that the only people in a position to make good decisions about how to manage scarce resources are private owners of the resources themselves. When private owners make trades with one another based on what they, based on their own expectations of what they're trying to accomplish, what their own goals are in life, and their own expectations for what the different resources might be worth at future times and things like that. When those private owners of resources make trades with each other, you get a free market price system. And that free market price system is the only way you can really allocate resources efficiently. Okay, I didn't set out to do a philosophy of economics here, so I didn't exactly think that explanation through before I said it. I'm sure I'll do better in the future. But the basic idea here is that only through a free market price system can you efficiently allocate resources, scarce resources. And the government, by definition, operates outside of a free market, a genuinely free market price system. The state operates, by definition, outside of true free market price system constraints. It ends up making essential stabs in the dark, shooting from the hip, to try to allocate scarce resources here, there, everywhere in a way that will accomplish its goals. And the point here to be clear about is that this is an economic argument, which means we're not saying necessarily that the government has evil intentions. The state often has very noble intentions. Okay, not all states are equally evil regarding the moral quality of the people in power. Many states have very good intentions behind what they do, at least theoretically. Certainly many of the bureaucrats and the workers in the various government agencies have good intentions. The problem is that it is not that they're evil, it's that they are incompetent. And again, not that they're incompetent in a morally culpable way, like, oh, if only they studied harder, or if only they paid more attention, they could do a better job. Rather, they are incompetent because human beings are not capable. Human beings simply cannot do the kinds of things that the state has claimed and put itself in a position to try to do, which is human beings cannot use their own finite minds and efficiently allocate scarce resources without having any access to a free market generated price system for those resources. Now, again, that's an economic argument in the article that gets into a lot more detail about things. I'll link to Ludwig von Mises' famous article on socialist calculation and so forth and why it's impossible at the article that I put up to accompany this video on the site. So for folks who want to get into that in more detail. Of course, there are some other economic problems we can talk about as well with the state, but that's the fundamental one. There's other problems would include things like unintended consequences of policies and things like that. But the basic fundamental problem is that the state inherently cannot efficiently allocate the resources that it controls. And so we'd be better off as a society not giving the state control of any scarce resources. So those are the basic problems. Now, a couple of quick objections here before we close this one out. You'll hear people say the first point is just to make that some people will say things like, well, you know, why do you guys hate the state so much? Why not other doers of violence? Why not other initiators of violence against peaceful people? You know, like say the mafia or you know, some sort of tribal army or something like that. And the answer is that we do. I mean, we're not picking on the state per se, and if we give that impression, it's only because the state is the current biggest enemy that we have to worry about. The vast majority of Americans, for instance, today are not having their liberties threatened by a mafia. Okay, they're having their liberties threatened by the state, and so the state is the other way to look at this is to think of it this way. Almost everyone already recognizes the problem with mafias. Everyone already understands the idea of, you know, the problems with having, you know, war in the streets. But what people do not currently seem to understand is the problems with the state. So anarchists and radical libertarians focus on the state because the state's the one that gets a free pass. That's why we focus on that particular institution of violence initiation. It's because it's the one that the vast majority of our fellow citizens and members of society still, for some reason, seem to think is okay. So until we can convince folks that that one's also wrong, we're not focusing as much on other forms that the violence may take. But yes, in a stateless society, you would also want to avoid not just having, you wouldn't just want to celebrate and rest on your laurels. Hey, we abolished the state yesterday, you know, yay for us. You would also need to still be concerned about other forms that violence may take as it tries to enter into society. So those would be real concerns, and you would have to you would have to deal with them. And we're not saying that we wouldn't. So we're not at all making some special place for the state to be picked on here. It's simply the problem is that we are objecting to all violent institutions as immoral, and since the state is one such institution, we also object to the state as immoral. Okay, I think that's all for now, folks. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for next time.